In a previous video we've already looked at Adobe Camera Raw and Smart Objects. What I'd like to do here is to look at Smart Objects in relation to multiple exposures. Using Smart Objects within Adobe Camera Raw certainly does broaden our opportunities within image editing. But we also have the opportunity to manipulate two different exposures from the same subject. One may be very well exposed for the foreground, but maybe not for the sky. The other will be well exposed for the sky, but possibly not so good in the foreground. Generally speaking, where we can, we should shoot these images from a tripod, but even that is not absolutely essential. What we're looking at here are two images that I've taken from a group of three automatically bracketed exposures, one stop apart. What I'd like to do before I open these up into Camera Raw is, using the metadata tab that I've got open up on the top left, is to select one of these images. Now you can see this image was shot with virtually 1 2/3 of a stop less exposure than the camera wished to give. So I've got a pretty good sky here. If we look at the other image, I've got a pretty good foreground, but the sky is beginning to be lost. So when I select this one, you can see this one actually had a little bit more exposure than the camera wanted to give. What I'm going to do is to use Smart Objects, Adobe Camera Raw, and we're going to amalgamate these two, and it's a lot easier than you would expect. We can make a start by selecting both of these images using the Control key. I can hit the Enter key and both of these will be opened up into Camera Raw. I can select which one I want to view in the center of the screen, the large image, by just selecting one or the other. But I can select both of the thumbnails by once again holding the Control key and selecting both. But I've got this one selected as my main image because I think this one is going to be probably the better of the two to adjust color balance, if nothing else. I'd begin the same way as always here. Over to the right hand side to my lens corrections. I'm going to remove chromatic aberration and I'm going to enable the profile corrections. Then straight over to the extreme top left to the white balance tool, because I can see a blue shift here, so I need to select somewhere in the water here that should be much closer to white, and click. And if I hold my cursor still, if you look up at that histogram just at the bottom left, you can see RGB, and you can see they're all much the same in value. Certainly nothing between them, which indicates the color balance is probably about right. But of course, we haven't touched the contrast or the clarity yet, and we can see a great deal of difference between the foreground and the sky. Back over to the right hand side to select the basic tab. Remember, what changes I'm doing here is going to affect both images, although at the moment I can only see one. We don't have to worry too much about that. I'm almost certain to want to give this a bit more clarity. I'm going to give it a healthy amount of vibrance. I'm pretty happy with what I've got in the foreground there. I may drop the exposure just a little bit, not much. Maybe drop the blacks down a little bit, maybe just bring the whites up a little bit, but I'm reasonably happy with that. What I'm going to do now is open up both of these objects into Photoshop. Once both the images open up, we'll see the tabs at the top of the screen, either by copy and paste or click and drag. I'm going to drag one of these out and I'm going to click, drag and drop. I'm going to hold the shift key while I do that, and you'll notice that it forces one image to drop foursquare on top of the other. I can close this one down without saving because I don't need it, because now I've got both of my images over on the right hand side in my layered stack. Let me remind you why it's a good thing to save this as a Photoshop file. It's rather like taking a snapshot in Adobe Camera Raw, but here we're dealing with two images. So I've saved a Photoshop file that retains the layered stack in the way we see it here, but it also retains the Smart Object status, which enables us to go back into Camera Raw at any time and make changes. So that's a good place to start saving this as a project. And as we go through and make various changes, you can always resave this and maybe give it a slightly different name, so you've got a number of versions as you work your way through. After a while, you'll probably dispense with doing that once you become a little more comfortable. So thinking about what we have here, the top layer is giving us a pretty good foreground. If I turn that off, we can see that in the bottom layer we've got a pretty good sky, although because I've adjusted these both together and I wasn't looking at this layer at the time, I think the sky is gone a little bit too colourful, so I may want to adjust that. But that's the beauty of working with smart objects in the way I am here, particularly with two different exposures, because we've got instant access back into Camera Raw to make these adjustments, and we'll do those in a moment. First up though, we need to blend the two together using a layer mask. So let's turn the top layer on, go down to the bottom left of the layers and select a layer mask. Once the mask is in place, I need to spray black on the mask to make parts of the top layer transparent to allow the sky from beneath to show through. This is always easier to demonstrate than to explain. So if we continue over to the left, let's make sure we've got black as our foreground color at the bottom of the toolbox. We need to select our gradient tool from midway up the toolbox, and the options at the top of the screen, we need linear mode, which is the default, and from the little window next door we need foreground to transparent, which is this one here. Now to create a gradient, all I need to do is click and drag, but what I'd like to do, before I do it live over this image, I'd like to do it once or twice on just the mask so you can get a feel for how the tool works. So I'm going to go over to my layers for the moment, because if we hold the Alt key and click the mask, we get to see the mask on the screen. So if I draw a short line, you can see that the gradient I create is very tight and short, and it matches the line. If I hit Ctrl Z, if I make a longer line, then of course the gradient gets a lot softer over a larger area, and finally I suppose if I go from top to bottom, there we can see it graduated from solid black to completely clear, but graduated across the whole width of the image. Now I'm going to reset that, so I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to undo that and click back to the little eye here to bring everything back in play. But with my mask selected on the right hand side, I'm going to draw a line. If you look just to the center right, you can just see the cursor in the sky there. I'm going to hold my Shift key. It just makes sure the line is absolutely upright. Don't have to, because we can draw a line at any angle we want. I'm going to click here and draw down, and there we get the first view of the two layers balanced together. Now the great thing about this process, of course, if I wasn't happy with that gradient, I can hit Ctrl Z. I could do this completely manually. I could use a brush and move away from the gradient tool. I could decide to try to use a tighter gradient to make it a little bit tighter along that horizon. But what we need to do when we get to this point is really to sit back and just take a look at the image, because we're using two separate exposures here, we do have an imbalance. Although we've got the best of both, I think we need to do just a little work on that sky and maybe a little work on the foreground, but not very much. Let's go back and take a look at that sky by selecting the smart object in Photoshop's layers, double clicking, and we're straight back to where we left off. Now if you remember last time, we give this quite a bit of vibrance, but of course we wasn't viewing this picture at the same time. So let me double click the vibrance and take it back. I'm going to do a little bit of difference here. I'm going to take the blacks off, take the whites off, because we're amalgamating now just the sky. So I quite like the clarity, but I'm going to add a little bit of dehaze, give it a bit of power. I do want a bit more colour, but I don't want quite as much yellow as that. Maybe I'll just drop that temperature down a little bit and push the colour up a bit more. I think I'm also going to look at the blacks just a little bit. We add a bit of power in there. The top left is the weak part, so perhaps here I could think of a graduated filter. Maybe if I drag down a filter over that sort of position. Within the filter I'll right click and reset. I'll drop the exposure a little bit up there, but then maybe I'll go down to my color options, click the panel, because I think I can put a nice warm tone in there to match the rest of the sky, and that looks pretty good to me. I'll click OK. Now I can decide if I want a little bit of dehaze up there. No, I don't think so. I think it looks pretty good. Let's try darkening it just a little more. I think I'm going to see how that looks, and now this is the beauty of working in this way. All I've got to do is click OK, put my cursor down and just look at what I've got and decide if I'm happy with what I've done. Now I think that's coming up quite well, but there is a slight imbalance between the sky and the foreground. If we're going to have the sky that dark, then I think the foreground needs to be a little bit darker than it is. Either that, or I've got to go back and lighten the sky. Now, because we're working with smart objects, doesn't matter how many times I go back and forth and make changes, we're not doing any damage to the quality of our image because we're always working on the raw file. So now I could switch to my foreground layer, double click and open that up into Camera Raw. I could decide to just tweak down the exposure a little bit. Maybe I'll put a little more contrast in it, maybe I'll tweak the whites, but I think that's more or less what I want. I quite like that, and I'm going to click OK, and once again I'll put my cursor down, and can you see how it's beginning to balance nicely now with the sky? But I'm just wondering if the sky needs to be just a little bit lighter, and this is the beauty of working as we are. Double click, straight back in, go to my exposure, just bring the exposure up just a little touch, not much at all. I may have gone a bit too far there, but it doesn't matter. Let's click OK. And you can see what I mean. We're getting a lovely balance between the two. And of course, now we are beginning to get that balance. We could even decide to go back to our mask. White is the background color. If you look over on the left hand side at the bottom of the toolbox, so I can flood my mask with white with Control Backspace. So even now I've got those two layers blended better from a contrast and color point of view. I could try applying the mask again. So let me just draw that line over there a little bit longer this time, and I think that's just a little bit better. So let's just stop and think about what we've done here. We've amalgamated two separately exposed images with no problem at all. This image was shot from a tripod, so it shouldn't be any problems in lining up the two images. But supposing we got to this point and we applied the layer mask and we realized that they're not entirely lined up. Supposing there was some hills in the background, or maybe even some trees. Well, we have a way to deal with this. Once we've finished doing the work on the two images, if you can work with the two images and ignore the fact that they don't blend as nicely as they should, there's little ghosts around the trees, then you can take the Smart Object status away by right-clicking a layer at any time and choosing to rasterize the layer. And all that does is remove the Smart Object status, and it takes the layer back to a standard layer. Once we did that, we would select both layers and we can leave the mask in place. Then we can go to Edit and we can choose Auto Align Layers. It's grayed out at the moment because I'm still working with Smart Objects. As soon as I remove them, I could align the layers. Auto align and then just OK in the next box, and prepare to be amazed by what Photoshop can do here. Anyway, back to our image, because I've got another thought here. Let's consider the sky for a moment, and I'm just going to double click this, go to my zoom tool, double click the zoom. I just want to hold the space bar, click and drag, and have a look at the noise in the sky. The noise in the sky is not too bad at all, but I'm just going to go to my details tab, little bit of luminance, probably about 20, just to smooth it a bit, not too much so people notice it very much, but it's just enough to take away a little bit of the noise, and I'll click OK. But of course, if I'm going to do that with one layer, I really need to do it with the other layer as well, but that's no difficulty. I'll put the same value in, 20. So there we have our image coming together nicely. Now I've just saved my image, given it a slightly different name. I've got a number 2 at the end of the file name, so I've got 2 versions to go back on. If you've got the patience to leave your image and come back a little bit later, or perhaps the next day, this is probably the stage it needs to be done. If we did that and we were sitting back looking at the image, what does the image need next, if anything? Well, I think it needs at least 2 main changes, and one which is probably a little bit more personal. But if we look at the rock down at the bottom left, I think we need to raise detail from that, because I've darkened it to a state where we're beginning to lose detail, and maybe we can use the same technique to raise the tone of the rock sticking out of the water elsewhere, just a little bit, not greatly. Now to do that, we'd need another smart object. I'm going to go alongside this layer, because that's the layer that I want to adjust, but I don't want to affect all of it, of course. So I'm going to go to the right of the mask, right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy. Look, just for a moment I'm going to drag that into the bin, and we'll reselect it in a minute, because this is the smart object I now want to double click and open up, and I want to make an adjustment here. I'm going to bring up the shadows just a little bit. I'm going to bring up the exposure just a little bit in that area. I'll drop the clarity a little bit. I'll take the blacks off, and you can see just a nice bit of tone appearing. Maybe we'll squeeze a bit more in there, something like that. And this is the beauty of working with different smart objects, because to get the tone right in the rock, you can see it's making the rest far too light, but we don't have to worry about that. Let's click OK to adjust that particular layer. And what I want to do next is to add a mask, but now I want to mask the entire image away. So if we hold the Alt key and click the mask, we get a mask automatically flooded with black, which means now we've got the opportunity to go to the bottom of the toolbox, use the double-headed arrow to switch to white as our foreground. I'm going to select a basic soft edge brush. From the options at the top of the screen, I'm going to drop my flow rate down to about 10%, and if you press this little button here, you can do that with the numbers on the keyboard. So if I hit the 1 key, I get 10%. Now I can use Control and Spacebar, click and zoom. Now I can start working. I need a decent sized brush, certainly for the middle here, and now I can start brushing over the rock to raise the tones to the degree I think is right. So away we go here, and as I always say when I do this work, I'm always doing this a little bit quick and dirty, because I'm always conscious of using up the video time that I've got. When I get down here where I'm going to blend between the rock and the water, I'll drop the flow rate even lower to 5, just to give myself a little bit more ease down there. Now back up to the top, I can adjust the brush to go around the edge, but we don't have to be overly fussy here, because we are working on a mask, and if something goes wrong we can always reverse the mask switch to black and do some repairs, but there you can see without too much difficulty I can bring a nice bit of detail through there. I've got a rock to the left here. If I wanted to do the same with that, I can do the same. Just bring a little bit of detail through. It's got a bit of lightness on there. Perhaps that's going to distract me, but we'll take a look. And now I can do the same with the other pieces of rock that's sticking out of the water. You can see I'm not raising them greatly, and it's not difficult work. Just need to be gentle with this, just to give them a little bit more. I'm going to take just a little more time and just go over all of these. See, I'm not sure that one wants too much, but I'll leave it as it is. I'm going to finish off the last of those rocks and I'll be back in no time. Now, as you can see, I've hit Control 0 to fit the image on screen, and I have just raised a little bit of tone, not massively, but as I always say, we're dealing with small, delicate steps here. I think perhaps I will give that little bright spot right down at the extreme bottom left corner a touch of the healing brush before I finish. But while I've got this layer selected up at the top right and the mask in place, one of the other things I wanted to have a look at, which I said was probably more personal, was to just bring through a couple of these light streaks a little more. Now, to do that, I'm probably going to drop my flow rate down to 1%, make my brush slightly smaller, but I'm just going to brush over some of these areas, and I need to brush in white, so I've just brought white to the fore of my colour picker there. Let me start up here and you'll be able to see the difference a little bit. I'm just raising the tones in the white here, but I'm only doing it delicately. You can see it just changing. Now, because I've got 1% flow, I have to move my brush over these areas a number of times before I start to see the change, but that is what makes the brush delicate and easy to use. The temptation is to go up here, push the flow rate up to 10 or 20%, then the brush runs away with us. The work we've done can be spotted a mile away. It just all goes badly wrong. So delicate and measured is what we're looking for in the light tone areas, just to give our image another little step in the number of stages we need to give it a bit of wow value. Now, I've just saved my project again, and I've put the number 3 after the file name, so I've got all 3 of these smart objects saved, because to move forward I want to flatten them all together now. I'm going to do that from the top right of the layers, little icon up at the top right, click and choose to flatten. What I'd like to do here next is to vignette the outside edge. If we was working with a single image in Adobe Camera Raw, we'd use the Radial Filter, which I sometimes call the circular filter by mistake, but it amounts to the same thing. Here I'm going to use my lasso tool, and I'm just going to make a lasso shape around the image. We can make a formal oval if we want, but sometimes I just make a shape something like that. But then I need to inverse that selection, so we've got the outer edge selected. To do that, I can go to my select menu and choose inverse. There is a shortcut, Control-Shift-I. Now, although I'd like to darken down the corners a little bit, I don't want to impact the rock in the bottom left here any more than I have to. After all, it was only a few moments ago when I raised tones in that. So what I may try to do here, if I go to the top left of the screen, I'm going to select this option, which is subtract from a selection. You'll see a little minus on the selection tool. So what I can do here is just start a selection here, and just basically I'm saying to Photoshop, when you make changes, don't make changes over that rock. What I also need though is that selection to be very, very soft. So I need to feather it via select and mask at the top leftish of the screen, and over on the right hand side of all of these sliders, the only one we're really interested in is a feather. I need that up somewhere well past 400. Let's say coming up to 500 there. That'll do. 485. Going to click OK to that. Now I'm going to bring up my levels. I'm going to do that with a shortcut, but it's found easily in the image menu. Control L will bring it on screen. All I want to do is to, well, let me hide my selection at the same time with Control H, because I want to move the mid-tone slider. You can see what I'm trying to do here. I just want to darken this down a little bit around the edges, something like that. Use the preview and you can see, look at the difference it makes. It is well worth having, isn't it? Click OK to that. Don't forget though that you may have a hidden selection in place. Either hit Control H or Control D to remove it. Now I still have a couple of things to do. One thing is to pick up that spot healing brush and just touch out that little highlight on that rock. That was a little distracting, and there's one there too, so maybe I'll just make my brush small and just touch that. Then I would have a timeout and just sit back and consider if I'm done, or I can tweak some more. Now I think we could end the manipulation here, but there is a couple of things I can suggest. Because of where I live on the coast, I do tend to take quite a number of seascapes. So with a picture like this, what I often do to complete it is to go up to my image menu and choose image size. I uncheck this little chain link because generally speaking the width and height are linked together, and I'm going to add about 400 pixels to the width. So I'm going to overtype the width value there to take it up to 6000. When I click OK, I just get that little extra width but nothing on the height. Just makes the picture seem to work that little bit better. And finally, what I may do is pick up my sponge tool, and from the top of the screen I'll choose saturate, probably no more than 10%. Make the brush slightly bigger, so if I wanted to just enhance a little bit of colour in a couple of strategic places, then I can do that. And once again I'm working a bit quick and dirty here, and I'm not enlarging the picture, but normally I would enlarge it and work a bit more careful. There we have the completed image. Now just a reminder, to be able to view images full screen like this within Photoshop, just touch the F key twice, and when you're done press the F key again and you'll go back into Photoshop. Now what I'd like to do here is compare this with the image we started with, but of course here we started with two completely differently exposed images, so it's not going to be a completely fair test, so I've chosen the one that had the good foreground. So this technique comes into its own when we've got a contrast problem. In other words, we've got two or more sections of the image where the contrast range is getting just a little too wide for us to be able to recover from that with just one shot. But also the technique enables us to combine two or more images, which limits how far we have to push the sliders to get the impact we're looking for. Now that's always going to be a good thing, because even when we're working in camera raw, there is still some trade-off when we have to lean on those sliders a bit heavier than we would otherwise like to do. Well, with two differently exposed shots, we don't have to. Something perhaps I should have mentioned at the start is the softness in the water here wasn't created with any filters. It's just a naturally slow shutter speed from shooting in the golden hour.